My name is Emma Carter, and if you'd asked me 2 years ago whether I trusted my family, I would have answered without hesitation. Absolutely. I trusted my husband, I trusted my younger sister, and I believed my father's greatest gift to me wasn't money. It was teaching me to see the good in people. Looking back now, I realize that lesson was only half complete. He also wanted me to recognize the moment when goodness had run out. I just didn't understand that until it was almost too late. My father, Richard Carter, passed away on a quiet October morning. He had spent most of his life restoring old homes throughout Colorado, and he believed every house deserved a second chance, just like every person. Some of my happiest memories were spent beside him, holding a flashlight while he repaired wooden floors or painted window frames. He always smiled whenever I asked why he never hired more workers. "Because some things are worth building with family," he'd say. I never imagined those words would become the key to everything. By then, I had been married to David for almost 11 years. He was charming in a way that made strangers trust him almost instantly. As one of the top real estate agents in Colorado Springs, confidence came naturally to him. Whenever we attended neighborhood events, people gravitated toward him. I never minded. I was the quieter one. Teaching history at the local high school suited me perfectly. I preferred listening over talking, watching over performing. David used to joke that together we made the perfect team. He sold dreams. I explained the lessons people forgot. For years, I believed him. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is? We argued over little things. Whose turn it was to buy groceries, whether we should remodel the kitchen, how much time he spent traveling for work. Nothing unusual, nothing that ever made me question the life we had built together. At least, not yet. My younger sister Lauren was only 3 years younger than me. Growing up, she had always been the adventurous one. While I stayed home reading books, Lauren wanted road trips, concerts, and spontaneous weekends in places she'd never visited before. As adults, our differences somehow made us closer. She called almost every Sunday, stopped by unannounced with coffee, remembered birthdays everyone else forgot. If anyone had asked me who my best friend was, I would have said Lauren without thinking twice. After Dad's funeral, the attorney invited us back to his office for the reading of the estate. It wasn't a dramatic gathering. No surprise relatives, no shouting, no shocking announcements. Dad had never been wealthy enough for that. Or so we all believed. The office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the attorney adjusted his glasses and opened a simple folder. Most of my father's savings had already gone toward medical bills during his final years. The old pickup truck would be donated to a veterans charity. Exactly as he'd requested, his woodworking tools would go to a local vocational school. His small cabin in the mountains had been sold months before his passing to help pay for treatment. Everything seemed painfully ordinary, until the attorney reached beneath the desk and placed a small wooden box in front of me. It wasn't expensive, just old, handmade. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. I recognized it immediately. Dad had built it himself when I was 12. I'd watched him sand every corner by hand. "This," the attorney said gently, "was to be given only to Emma." I frowned. "That's all?" He nodded. "Your father was very specific." I looked around the room. Lauren offered me a sympathetic smile. David squeezed my shoulder. Neither of them seemed surprised. Neither of them looked disappointed. At the time, that felt comforting. Today, I know better. When we got home that evening, David carried the box into the living room. "You should open it," he said. His voice sounded warm, patient, exactly the way a supportive husband should sound. I lifted the lid. Inside was a folded handwritten letter, an old brass key, and a faded photograph of Dad standing in front of a white farmhouse I'd never seen before. There was nothing else. No jewelry, no cash, no legal documents, just 3 ordinary objects. I unfolded the letter. "Emma, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There are things I wanted to tell you while I was alive, but some truths only become clear when people believe they're no longer being watched. Trust your instincts, not appearances. The key belongs to something that has always been yours. When the time is right, you'll know where it fits. Love, Dad." I read the letter twice, then a third time. It made no sense. "What do you think he meant?" David asked. I laughed softly. "I honestly have no idea." He smiled. "I'm sure it's just sentimental." Maybe it was. Maybe grief was making me search for meaning where none existed. I slipped the letter back inside the box and placed it on the bookshelf beside old family photo albums. Life slowly returned to normal. Or at least, it pretended to. 3 weeks later, I came home early after parent-teacher conferences had been canceled because of a snowstorm. The house was unusually quiet. David had texted that he was showing a property across town. I made myself a cup of tea and sat near the living room window while heavy snow drifted across the street. That's when my phone buzzed. Lauren. She had sent a picture. Probably another recipe. Or one of the rescue dogs she was always volunteering with. Without thinking, I opened it. The image loaded slowly. Then my entire world tilted. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't food. It wasn't meant for me at all. It was a scanned property document. At the top of the page, in bold letters, was our home address. Halfway down, I saw my husband's signature, and directly beneath it, Lauren Carter, my sister's name, listed beside his. Not mine. I stared at the screen so long that my tea turned cold in my hands. A second later, the message disappeared. Lauren unsent a message, but she was too late. I'd already seen it. And in that single moment, the little wooden box my father had left me no longer felt like a sentimental keepsake. It felt like the beginning of a warning. People often imagine betrayal as a loud, dramatic moment, a screaming match, a shattered glass, a suitcase thrown across the living room. Real betrayal isn't like that. Most of the time, it's painfully quiet. It sits across from you at dinner, asks how your day went, and kisses your forehead before going to bed. That evening, I never mentioned the document. I made dinner. David talked about a difficult client who couldn't decide between two houses. I nodded in all the right places. I even laughed once when he made a joke about a buyer wanting a dream kitchen on a starter home budget. If anyone had walked into our dining room, they would have seen an ordinary married couple. Only one thing had changed. I had stopped believing every word he said. After he fell asleep, I quietly carried my laptop into the guest bedroom. For 15 years, I'd taught my students that history isn't built on opinions. It's built on evidence. Funny how my own life suddenly required the same lesson. The property document Lauren had accidentally sent disappeared before I could download it. But one detail had burned itself into my memory. Our address, David's signature, Lauren's name. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she had witnessed paperwork. Maybe she'd helped with some temporary filing. Maybe. I wanted there to be a reasonable answer. I just couldn't think of one. I logged into our county's online property records. Most documents were public. After a few searches, our house appeared exactly where it should. Owner, Emma Carter, David Carter, nothing unusual. For a moment, I actually smiled. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe grief was making me suspicious. Then I noticed something at the bottom of the page. Additional filings. One had been recorded only 6 weeks earlier. The document itself wasn't available online. Only its title, Transfer Affidavit. I frowned. Why would there be a transfer affidavit? We hadn't sold the house. We hadn't refinanced. No attorney had contacted me. No bank had requested signatures. The filing made no sense, and whenever something makes no sense, there's usually a reason. The next morning, I stopped by the county clerk's office before school. The woman behind the counter smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I'd like a certified copy of a property filing." She asked for the address, typed for a few seconds, then her smile faded. "I'm sorry." She looked back at the screen. "Only listed parties can request this particular document." Listed parties. The phrase echoed inside my head. "I'm one of the homeowners." She nodded. "I understand." Another pause. "According to this filing," she hesitated. "You're not." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," she added gently. "There may have been an error. You'll need to speak with the attorney who prepared the paperwork." I thanked her automatically and walked back to my car. Only after closing the driver's door did I realize my hands were shaking. Not violently. Just enough that I had to grip the steering wheel before starting the engine. Someone had changed something involving my home. Without me. That afternoon, I called David. "I stopped by the county office today." His voice remained calm. "Oh?" "I had questions about some paperwork." A brief silence. "So?" "They said there was a transfer filing." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he laughed. "Oh, that!" Relief washed through me so quickly I almost hated myself for feeling it. "There is an explanation?" "Of course." "What is it?" "Our accountant suggested moving some paperwork around for liability purposes." "Without telling me?" "I didn't want to bother you." His answer arrived too quickly, too smoothly, almost rehearsed. "It doesn't change anything," he continued. "It's just legal paperwork." Legal paperwork. People love hiding behind those words. They make almost anything sound harmless. "I'll explain tonight," he promised. "You worry too much." I ended the call politely. But something inside me whispered a question I couldn't ignore. If everything was perfectly innocent, why hadn't he mentioned it 6 weeks ago? Instead of going home after work, I drove to my father's old workshop. The building had been empty since his funeral. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. His workbench still stood exactly where he'd left it. The scent of cedar lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves refused to forget him. I found myself staring at the little brass key from the wooden box. It rested in my palm, cool, and surprisingly heavy. Dad had never done anything without a reason, especially not near the end of his life. His letter came back to me. "Trust your instincts, not appearances." At the time, those words had felt comforting. Now they sounded like instructions. I slipped the key back into my pocket. Then my eyes landed on something I'd overlooked before. Mounted high above the workbench was a faded photograph, the same white farmhouse from the picture inside the wooden box. Only this version showed more of the landscape. And in the background, almost hidden behind a row of trees, was a small red barn. My heart skipped. I'd seen that barn before. Years ago, when I was a little girl. There had been a property Dad used to visit every few months. He always said it belonged to an old friend. He never took anyone inside. Not even me. I'd forgotten about it completely. Until now. When I arrived home that evening, David was already there. He greeted me with a smile, wrapped his arms around me, kissed my forehead. The same routine we'd shared for years. Only this time, I noticed something new. His embrace lasted just a little too long, almost as if he were checking whether I still believed him. Over dinner, he explained the transfer paperwork exactly the way he'd promised. It was just asset protection. Our accountant recommended it. It doesn't affect our marriage. It doesn't affect ownership. Everything sounded reasonable, except one thing. He never actually answered my question. Whose name had replaced mine? I didn't press him. Not yet. Because people who think they've convinced you usually stop protecting themselves. And I was beginning to understand something my father had known long before I did. The truth rarely reveals itself during the first lie. It reveals itself when the liar believes you've accepted the first one. Later that night, after David had gone to sleep, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. One new message. Unknown number. There were only 7 words. Don't trust the paperwork. Find the farmhouse first. I didn't sleep that night. The anonymous message stayed on my screen long after I turned off the bedroom light. Don't trust the paperwork. Find the farmhouse first. I must have read those 7 words 100 times. Who sent them? How did they know about the property? More importantly, how did they know about my father? I considered replying. Instead, I locked my phone and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. Whoever had sent that message clearly knew more than I did. If they wanted me to find the farmhouse, then maybe my father had been trying to lead me there all along. The next morning, I called the school and asked for a personal day. It wasn't something I normally did. In 12 years of teaching, I'd only taken a handful of unexpected days off, but grading papers suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the questions racing through my mind. I grabbed the small wooden box from the bookshelf. Inside were the same 3 items: the handwritten letter, the brass key, the faded photograph. This time I studied the picture more carefully. Dad stood in front of the white farmhouse with one hand resting casually in his pocket. Behind him sat the little red barn I'd recognized the day before. In the corner of the photograph, almost hidden by age and faded colors, was something I'd never noticed. A weathered mailbox. The number painted on it was barely visible. 17. That was enough. Colorado Springs had changed a lot over the years, but rural roads had a way of resisting time. After almost an hour of driving through winding country highways, familiar memories slowly returned. Dad had brought me here once, maybe twice. I couldn't have been older than 10. Back then, the drive had felt endless. Now every turn awakened another forgotten memory. The old wooden bridge, a tiny church with white walls, an abandoned grain silo. Then I saw it. The mailbox, number 17, exactly like the photograph. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. The farmhouse still stood at the end of a long gravel driveway. White paint, wide front porch, blue shutters. Time had aged it, but it was unmistakably the same place. I parked near the gate and simply sat there for a moment. My father had never told me this place belonged to him. He'd always called it an old friend's property. Had that been another lie? Or was there something else he had been protecting? The front yard was quiet. Too quiet. No cars, no lights, only the sound of wind moving through the tall pine trees surrounding the property. As I walked toward the porch, every board beneath my feet creaked softly. The house felt empty, but not abandoned. Someone had been maintaining it. The flower beds were trimmed, the porch had been swept recently. Even the windows looked clean. Who was taking care of this place? I knocked. No answer. I waited another minute before trying the doorknob. Locked. I reached into my purse. The brass key felt heavier than before. My father had written, "You'll know where it fits." Maybe? This was what he meant. The old lock resisted for a second. Then, click. The door opened. The smell inside wasn't one of neglect. It smelled like cedar, old books, freshly polished wood. Someone had cared for this home. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, filling the living room with a warm, golden glow. The furniture looked old but immaculate. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Family photographs covered another. I stepped closer. Every picture featured my father. Some showed him as a young man, others captured birthdays, Christmas mornings, summer afternoons. But something immediately caught my attention. I wasn't in any of them. Neither was Lauren. Instead, a little girl I'd never seen before appeared in nearly every photograph beside my father. She couldn't have been older than 6, blonde hair, bright smile, holding Dad's hand as if she'd known him her entire life. I felt my stomach tighten. Who was she? I slowly walked through the house. The kitchen looked untouched. The dining table had been set for 4 people, as though someone expected guests who never arrived. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued ticking with perfect precision. Time hadn't stopped here. Only life had. At the end of the hallway stood a small office. The same brass key fit the desk drawer without hesitation. Inside rested a leather journal, a folder, and another envelope. My name was written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Emma. Only Emma. No last name. No instructions. Just my name. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. If you found this house, then you've already discovered someone has been lying to you. Do not confront them. Not yet. Everything you need is inside the journal. But before you read it, look behind the fireplace. I lowered the letter slowly. Behind the fireplace? The stone fireplace stretched nearly to the ceiling. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I remembered something Dad used to tell me whenever we worked on old houses. Builders always leave one stone that doesn't belong. I examined the stonework carefully. Most of the rocks were rough and gray, except one, near the bottom. Smoother, slightly darker, almost impossible to notice unless you were looking for it. I pressed it. A soft, mechanical click echoed inside the wall. My heartbeat accelerated. Part of the fireplace shifted backward, just enough to reveal a narrow hidden compartment. Inside rested a thick envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front were 6 handwritten words. Only if David betrays your trust. I couldn't breathe. My father hadn't guessed. He had prepared. Years before any of this happened, He had already expected it. And somehow, he had known exactly whose name would be written on that envelope. I stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. Only if David betrays your trust. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They were calm, certain, as if my father had never doubted this day would come. My hands felt cold as I carefully broke the dark blue wax seal. Inside were several documents neatly organized. A handwritten letter rested on top. I recognized Dad's handwriting immediately. He had always written slowly, every letter perfectly formed, as though he believed important words deserved patience. I unfolded the pages. Emma, if you've opened this envelope, then my greatest fear became reality. First, let me tell you something I should have said while I was alive. None of this is your fault. You have always believed the best about people. Never be ashamed of that. Kindness is not weakness. Trust is not foolishness. The only shame belongs to those who choose to abuse it. If David has betrayed you, I need you to know something. I never trusted him. Not because he was rude, not because he was dishonest in obvious ways, because he was too interested in what people owned. Every conversation eventually became about houses, money, investments, property. Most people reveal themselves without realizing it. You simply have to watch long enough. I watched. And I prepared. Love, Dad. My vision blurred, not from tears, from disbelief. He had seen something years before I ever did, something I had dismissed because I wanted my marriage to succeed. I looked deeper into the envelope. There were property records, bank documents, a trust agreement. Then one document stopped me completely. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "The Carter Family Heritage Trust" beneath it. Primary beneficiary. Emma Carter. Not David, not Lauren. Only me. I sat down in my father's old leather chair. The trust documents were surprisingly simple. Years earlier, Dad had quietly transferred several properties into the trust. The farmhouse, nearly 100 acres surrounding it. 2 rental cabins in the mountains. A commercial building in downtown Colorado Springs. None of those properties had ever passed through probate. Legally. They had never become part of his estate, which explained why the attorney had said almost nothing during the reading of the will. Those assets had never been available for public discussion. My father hadn't died with almost nothing. He had protected everything. I continued reading. The trust contained one unusual condition. As long as I remained happily married, the trust would remain inactive. I wouldn't even know it existed. But if my marriage ended because of fraud, infidelity, or financial deception, everything would immediately transfer into my control. The evidence would only need to be reviewed by the trustee. I leaned back in my chair. Dad hadn't simply left me an inheritance. He had designed a safety net, one that would only appear if my life fell apart. I suddenly remembered something. The anonymous message. Find the farmhouse first. Someone knew about the trust. Someone wanted me to discover it before David realized I had. My phone still showed the unknown number. No replies, no additional messages, just silence. As I gathered the papers, another object slipped from the envelope. A small business card, one name, Margaret Ellis Trust Administrator. I frowned. Margaret? That couldn't be right. Margaret was David's mother. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the card. She had known? Impossible. Unless she hadn't been protecting David. She'd been protecting me. Almost on instinct, I picked up my phone and dialed the number printed beneath her name. It rang twice, 3 times. Then someone answered. Emma? Her voice was soft, almost relieved. You found the farmhouse. I stood perfectly still. You knew I'd come here? I've been hoping you would. Why didn't you tell me any of this? A long silence followed. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice carried years of exhaustion. Because your father made me promise. My heart skipped. You knew my father? We were friends long before you met David. Everything inside me shifted. The story I thought I understood was becoming something entirely different. I wanted to tell you so many times, she whispered. But Richard believed you'd only understand if you discovered the truth yourself. I closed my eyes. So, he knew? He knew enough. He never trusted David. No. Did you? Another silence. Longer this time. Finally. I wanted to. Margaret asked me not to leave the farmhouse just yet. I'm coming there, she said. It'll take about 40 minutes. There are things you deserve to hear face to face. Before hanging up, she added one sentence that sent another chill through my body. And Emma, don't go home tonight. I slowly lowered the phone. Outside, the afternoon sky had darkened. Heavy clouds rolled across the mountains. Wind rattled the old windows. The farmhouse suddenly felt less like an abandoned memory, and more like a place that had been waiting for me. While I organized the documents into neat stacks, I heard something outside. A car. Not one. Two. They weren't coming from the front road. They were approaching from the back of the property. I carefully pulled the curtain aside. A black SUV stopped near the red barn. A second vehicle parked behind it. The driver's door opened. My heart nearly stopped. David stepped out. Lauren climbed out of the passenger side. They looked around as if making sure no one was watching. Then David reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. The same kind of old brass key my father had left me. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. David and Lauren weren't supposed to know this place existed. At least, that's what I'd believed. Yet there they were, walking across the property as though they'd been there before. David unlocked the barn with a brass key nearly identical to the one my father had left me. Lauren glanced nervously over her shoulder. Unlike David, she didn't look confident. She looked frightened. I stepped away from the window before either of them could see me. The farmhouse sat slightly above the barn, hidden by a row of old pine trees. Unless someone deliberately looked toward the house, they wouldn't notice anyone watching from inside. I forced myself to stay calm. Dad had written 2 simple instructions. Do not confront them. Until now, I'd followed them. I wasn't about to stop. I quietly walked into the office and found an old pair of binoculars resting on a bookshelf. They still worked perfectly. From the upstairs bedroom window, I had a clear view of the barn. David rolled up one of the large wooden doors. Lauren remained outside, arms crossed against the cold wind. She kept checking her phone. Then she said something. I couldn't hear the words. David answered with an impatient gesture before disappearing inside. A minute later, he emerged carrying several dusty file boxes. Not furniture, not tools, boxes, heavy ones. He loaded them into the back of the SUV one after another. Whatever they had come for. They already knew exactly where to find it. A sudden knock at the front door made me jump. 3 soft knocks. Then silence. I hurried downstairs. Emma. A familiar voice called gently. It's Margaret. I opened the door. David's mother looked older than I remembered. The last few weeks seemed to have aged her by years. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and looked directly into my eyes. I'm so sorry. Those were the first words she spoke. Not hello, not how are you, just, I'm so sorry. Without thinking, I hugged her. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence carried more honesty than most conversations I'd had in years. Margaret finally looked toward the window overlooking the barn. They're here. You knew they would come? She nodded. I was afraid they would. You know what they're taking? Another slow nod. Your father kept records. What kind of records? Everything. She turned toward me. Richard trusted paper more than promises. That sounded exactly like him. He documented every business conversation he ever had with David. I frowned. Business conversation? Margaret sighed. Emma, David approached your father 3 years before you got married. What? He wanted Richard to invest in his real estate company. I never knew that. Because your father never told you? Why not? Because he refused. Margaret walked into the office and gently placed her hand on the old leather journal. Your father believed David wasn't building a business. He believed he was building leverage. I stared at her. I don't understand. He didn't want partners. He wanted access. Access to what? Property. She looked toward the window again. Especially yours. My stomach tightened. Margaret explained everything slowly. Years earlier, David had learned that my father quietly owned several valuable properties. He had repeatedly suggested creating joint investment companies, property partnerships, development projects. Each proposal looked reasonable on paper, but Richard had refused every single one. He once told me something I'll never forget, Margaret said. What? He said. She smiled sadly. A man who keeps asking what something is worth usually isn't asking because he loves it. That sounded exactly like Dad. He believed value and price were never the same thing. So why did David marry me? The question escaped before I realized I'd spoken aloud. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat down across from me. I've asked myself that for years. Did he ever love me? I think he believed he did. I closed my eyes. But he also believed your future inheritance would eventually become his. The words hurt, not because they were loud, because they were quiet, believable. A loud metallic crash echoed from outside. Both of us hurried back to the window. David had dropped one of the file boxes. Its contents spilled across the gravel. Documents scattered everywhere. Lauren rushed to help gather them. The wind caught several loose pages. White sheets flew across the property like frightened birds. One landed near the farmhouse porch. Another struck the fence. A third drifted directly beneath my window. Without thinking, I ran outside. The cold air hit my face as I hurried across the porch. The page had become trapped beneath a flower pot. I picked it up. It wasn't an old property record. It was recent. Very recent. At the top appeared the logo of David's real estate company. Below that, a project proposal. Then one line froze me where I stood. Future development site. Carter Heritage Farm. Development? My father had never spoken about developing this land. The next paragraph explained everything. Luxury vacation homes, private access roads, commercial retail space, estimated project value, 8 million. I suddenly understood. This had never been about our house. It had never been about my inheritance alone. David had spent years trying to gain control of hundreds of acres he believed would someday belong to me. And if he controlled me, he controlled everything. I folded the document and slipped it into my coat pocket, just as voices drifted toward the farmhouse. "They're almost done," Lauren said. "We need to hurry." David answered calmly, "No one knows this place exists." I stepped backward into the shadows beside the porch. They were less than 30 feet away, close enough that I could hear every word. Lauren hesitated. "What if Emma finds out?" David laughed. "By the time she understands what's happening, there won't be anything left for her to save." At that exact moment, Margaret's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. The color drained from her face. "What is it?" I whispered. She slowly turned the phone toward me. The caller ID showed only 2 words. Family attorney. Margaret answered immediately. She listened for only a few seconds before closing her eyes. When the call ended, she looked at me with quiet urgency. "Emma, they've just filed the paperwork." "What paperwork?" "The petition to declare you mentally unfit. So David can take legal control of everything in your name." For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Mentally unfit? The words didn't even sound real. I looked at Margaret, waiting for her to tell me there had been some mistake. Instead, she slowly nodded. "I'm afraid it's true." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. How is that even possible? They've been planning this for months. I leaned against the porch railing to steady myself. "Explain." Margaret took a deep breath. "David knew he couldn't reach the trust while you remained legally capable of managing your own affairs. So he decided to make everyone believe I wasn't?" She nodded again. "Unfortunately, yes." Inside the farmhouse, Margaret spread several documents across the dining room table. "I've suspected something for a while," she said, "but I never had proof." She pointed toward one page. "This is a copy of the petition filed this morning." I scanned the first paragraph. It claimed that I had become emotionally unstable after my father's death, that I had isolated myself, made irrational financial decisions, displayed signs of severe depression. Every sentence was a lie, but every lie had been carefully written to sound believable. Then I noticed something else. 3 sworn witness statements, one from David, one from Lauren, and one from our family doctor. I stared at the signature. "No," Margaret quietly nodded. "They convinced him you needed help." I felt physically sick. Looking back, I remembered every strange question the doctor had asked during my annual checkup a month earlier. Had I been sleeping well? Was I feeling overwhelmed? Had grief affected my concentration? At the time, they had seemed like ordinary questions. Now they looked very different. Someone had built a story around my answers, a story I never knew I was helping them write. They wanted a temporary guardianship, Margaret explained, just long enough to gain authority over your financial decisions. And after that, they would challenge control of the trust. They can't. No. She smiled for the first time that day. They think they can. I looked toward the stack of documents my father had left behind. The trust protects me. It does. So why am I still scared? Margaret reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Because you're kind, you assume other people play by the rules. David doesn't. A loud engine started outside. We hurried back to the window. The black SUV slowly pulled away from the barn. The second vehicle followed behind it. They're leaving, I whispered. Margaret watched silently until both vehicles disappeared beyond the trees. Then she turned toward me. Good. Good? They've made their first mistake. I frowned. What mistake? They believe those boxes contain everything your father kept. They don't, Margaret smiled. Richard expected someone would eventually come looking. She walked back into the office. Without saying a word, she knelt beside the old bookshelf and pulled out a single history book. Nothing happened. Then she reached farther inside the empty shelf. A hidden latch clicked. Another compartment slowly opened beneath the floorboards. I stared in disbelief. Inside were dozens of neatly labeled binders. Photographs, audio cassettes, hard drives, legal files, receipts, handwritten journals. Everything carefully dated, everything meticulously organized. My father hadn't simply kept records, he had built an archive. He documented every meeting, Margaret said, every proposal, every contract David ever asked him to sign. She picked up one thick binder. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, were 4 words. David Morgan. Complete file. I looked at her in astonishment. Complete. He never threw anything away. We opened the binder together. The very first page was dated 12 years earlier, nearly a year before David and I had started dating. Attached to it was a business proposal requesting ownership percentages in several Carter family properties. Rejected. The next section contained emails, then meeting notes, then copies of text messages. Each year the requests became more aggressive, more personal, less professional, until one handwritten note stopped me cold. It had been written by my father after a lunch meeting with David. Today, he asked more questions about Emma than about the investment. He isn't interested in my properties. He's interested in becoming family. I slowly lowered the page. Dad had seen it before anyone else. Margaret handed me another folder. This one matters even more. Inside was a private investigator's report, commissioned by my father, completed 10 years earlier. The investigator had followed David for 3 weeks. No crimes, no affairs, no scandals. But one observation appeared several times. Subject consistently seeks relationships with individuals connected to inherited wealth or family-owned real estate. I closed the folder. Suddenly everything made sense. The charm, the patience, the perfect timing, none of it had been accidental. So why didn't Dad stop the wedding? Margaret looked out the window before answering. Because he hoped he was wrong. She smiled sadly. He wanted his daughter to be loved. The words hit harder than anything else. Dad hadn't distrusted me. He had distrusted his own instincts. And when he realized they were probably right, he quietly built a way to protect me without destroying my happiness. The room fell silent. Then my phone buzzed. David. Calling. For the first time all day. Margaret looked at the screen. Don't answer. I let it ring. A second later, another call. Lauren. Then another. David again. 3 missed calls in less than 2 minutes. They've realized something, Margaret whispered. Before I could respond, another notification appeared. This time it wasn't a phone call. It was a banking alert. Urgent. A request has been submitted to add an authorized financial representative to your primary accounts. My blood ran cold. David wasn't waiting for the court anymore. He had already started moving. Margaret looked me straight in the eyes. Emma, they've begun earlier than we expected. And if we don't stop them before tomorrow morning, they'll believe they've already won.